what's up? I thought I would give you guys a few helpful tips, drop a wisdom bomb on you when it comes to shooting your digital SLR in manual mode. You should have, I hope you have watched Josh Jack's video about, putting it into auto mode and all that, the basic overview of our new Canons. But mentioned about shooting it in manual and advised for you to not shoot in manual. I agree. Just don't shoot in manual unless you're super confident you know what you're doing, because otherwise you'll wind up with video at the end of the day that you will have no way of correcting, which is bad. That's bad. But if you do, there are certain situations where you might want to shoot manual. In fact, manual might even become a necessity at sometimes. So I figured I'd go over real quick the three basic aspects that are controlled by shooting in manual. And those three aspects are ISO, aperture, and shutter. All three of these, when in manual mode, have to be adjusted by you, the operator. And they all have to do with light. They all have to do with how much light goes into the video. But they all have wildly different effects on them. And like I said before, there might be situations where you might need to use a manual mode. I'll give you an example. I thought about something earlier. If you're out on a work site and you're shooting indoors, it's a very, very dark situation, especially if there's no lighting on the inside of the house. And, obviously your camera has a little light sensor in here. It will detect that it's low light and it will change the settings accordingly. However, there are things that can confound that camera sensor, because it's just a computer thinking of this. It's not smart, right? It can't make the best decision all the time. For example, if you're inside a house, they're working, and someone's put a floodlight up so they can see, your camera's light sensor will see that floodlight, and it will make adjustments assuming that you're in bright sunlight, when in fact you're not, and that will mess up the video if it's in auto. So I think it's a good idea for you guys to know exactly how to shoot in manual. So the first thing we'll talk about, because it's the easiest to understand and the easiest to deal with, is ISO. And ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. ISO, not kidding, stands for International Organization for Standardization. ISO. Anyway, ISO you can think of as like gain for audio. You guys ever messed with, like on the top bar of a PreSonus board, it has the gain, and it tells the board to be more sensitive to sound. ISO is kind of like that. The higher your ISO, the higher the sensitivity to light is. And now you might be thinking, oh, well, that's great. If you're super dark, you just crank that ISO all the way up. But having a higher ISO comes with a drawback, and that is the higher your ISO and the lower light that you're in, the more interference, the more film grain you'll get. You'll get kind of like that sandy, grainy film over your screen, and it's not good. So the rule of thumb for ISO, especially for us working on Project Cam, is just have it as low as you can have it with it not affecting your video. What I mean by that is if you are in bright, direct sunlight, you can have your ISO either all the way as far down as it will allow or around 200%. A lot of digital SLRs by default make the lowest end of ISO 200. So if you're in bright light, that's about what you want to go with. As you get darker and darker, if you're shooting on in the evening or if you're inside or something like that, you may want to turn that up a little bit. You want to avoid going to the super high-end side of it. Some cameras do better than others. I know our the Canon TI5 that we're using, it's known to be all right in low light situations, but especially for video, you don't want to have high ISO. In photography, you can adjust the length of time it takes to shoot your picture because it's just a still, right? But when it comes to video, you're shooting 30 frames a second no matter what, and you got to stay at 30 frames a second, which means there's no compensation for, if you have to use high ISO, there's nothing you can do about it. So, recommend 200, step it up a little bit if you've got to. Most of the time, your auto will be fine. There'll be no reason for you to manually adjust it, unless it's like we talked about before, some sort of extenuating circumstance, something like that. But even in those situations, ISO most of the time takes care of its stuff just fine. But except if you are shooting at night, like for your thank you video or something, or you're shooting in a low light situation and you can't do anything with the shutter or aperture, you want to make sure your ISO doesn't swing super high to compensate, because otherwise you will get that grainy look to your video, and that's just not cool. So the second thing we'll talk about is the aperture. And the aperture is basically a contraption inside the camera that gets smaller and larger to let more or less light in. It's what most people call the shutter. Like if I showed you a picture of it, I guarantee you most people would say, oh, that's the shutter. That's the camera shutter. If you look at the World Changers AV logo that I made, that's what it is. The globe's been replaced by an aperture. And so the aperture, basically, it's how wide the eye of the camera is. Low apertures settings, like very common one, this camera right here is 1.7. More frequently they get on up, especially if you have like the zoom lenses, they switch. The farther in you're zoomed, the lower your aperture has to be. Right here I've got a 3.5 to 5.6 Nikon. It's about 5 years old. That's what the lens is. That's an okay range. I'm not exactly sure what the lens on our Canon is, but basically the long and short of it is small aperture, low light, wide aperture, lots of light. And the reason that's important is because the aperture lets you change how much light you're getting without changing the shutter speed, which we'll get into in a second. The other effect that aperture does is it helps create the illusion of depth of field. You can see it, I'll show it on the screen. Lower apertures can create a more narrow depth of focus. So like you can have a subject and then everything behind it be more blurry. That's caused by lower aperture settings. This camera right here, like I said, it's 1.7, and even though I'm not super far away from my background, less than a foot, you can kind of tell how things go in and out of focus very, very quickly. See, I just extend my hand, and you can tell immediately that hand is out of focus, even though it's just a foot or two away from my face. This would be an example of, like I said, that floodlight situation where you might be somewhere where your sensor thinks there's a lot of light, but there's not. You may want to adjust your aperture setting. When you're doing interviews, you may want to turn that aperture a little farther down on a low end. If you have enough light, you can do that, and you can create a more compelling shot where your subject that you're interviewing is in focus and everything behind them is out of focus. It looks really cool. It's really awesome. You want to avoid, again, higher apertures when you're shooting outdoors. Typically, what you want to keep the aperture as static as possible. In other words, when you're changing the light, if you can, try and keep the aperture about the same, just so that there's a consistent look with the depth of field in your video. A lot of times, if you're shooting landscape stuff or stuff that's kind of out in the distance, like a house and all the participants working, it's not going to matter as much. And again, that's completely subjective. If you like changing the aperture to get different kinds of perspective, like maybe you want a shot that is kind of a little bit more intimate, you want to crank the aperture a little higher up so that everything's kind of in focus around it, that's cool. Or if you want to kind of isolate something and bring it a little bit farther into frame and then leave everything a little bit blurry, you may want to lower that aperture a little bit. But in any case, it's up to you, as long as you know what it does. But that does bring us to this little dial here. This is a Nikon, so it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty standardized across DSLRs. You normally have M, A, and S. And the M, of course, is manual. A is aperture priority. It's not auto. I made that mistake. For years I shot when I was a newbie. I shot with this camera on A when I thought it was auto. It's not. It's aperture priority. What that means is that it will lock the aperture at a certain openness for whatever you set, and it will change all the other settings like shutter and ISO in order to keep that aperture the same. Which, sometimes you may want to use that. And then you have S, which is shutter priority, which means it will keep the shutter speed the same, and it will change everything else to accommodate it. Which brings us neatly to the last thing, which is shutter speed. Shutter speed, if you don't know how a DSLR works, it's basically behind the lens, there's a sensor. You can't see the sensor because my mirror is down in front of it. Basically, there's a sensor. You can think of that as the eyeball of the camera. And when you press the button, the mirror, basically, it slaps down. I'll put a link in the description, a video showing the effect. Basically, the mirror slaps down and lets the light in. It works a little different for video, but the shutter speed does not. The shutter speed, in essence, works basically the same. There is a metal curtain, for lack of a better term, there's a metal curtain that goes across the what do you call it? The sensor. And it basically determines how long that image sensor is exposed to light. So if it moves down very quickly, you have very little light, but if it moves slower, you have a lot of time where that sensor is exposed to light. It's basically, you could think about it, it's if the aperture is how wide your eye is. What is that? Oh snap! It's Kyle, guys. He sent out an email. You better stop doing what you're doing. You better check your email, because Kyle just did. Hold on, give me a second. It was the driving form. Do it now. If you can kind of think of aperture as how wide the camera's eye is, the shutter speed is how fast you blink or how often you blink. If that makes any sense, it makes sense to me. In photography, often you can see the picture I took here. Often in photography, you want to have long shutter speeds in order to gain more light, and that's okay because if you're taking a still, it doesn't matter. You can, as long as you have a tripod, you can keep the shutter open as long as you want. When you're doing video, however, having the shutter too far open creates a blurry effect, and here's where we get to it. Whoa. Here's where we get to a real danger of DSLR shooting on auto, is that a lot of cameras, I don't know if our Canon does it, but a lot of cameras, if you have it on auto and you're shooting video and it detects that you've gone into a dark room where there's not enough light, it will change the shutter speed to compensate. And often, I've seen this with several models of camera, it will change the shutter speed to be lower per second than your frame rate. And here's what I mean by that. Because shutter speed is measured in fraction of a second. So a very common shutter speed is 1/250ths of a second. If that's not how you say it, I apologize. 1/250ths of a second. That's a mouthful. And basically that means that's how long it takes for the shutter to go across the lens, the image sensor. But if you make the shutter speed lower than 1/130th of a second, that means that your camera is actually creating more frames in the amount of time it takes for the shutter to go across the image sensor. And so you get this really weird effect when you do that. It gets like all psychedelic 1960s weird effect. So I don't know if our Canons do this, but I know this camera does it, and I know that this camera does it unless you tell it otherwise. It will actually dip, when it's an auto, it will actually dip below 1/130th of a second when shooting video if you're in a dark area, which means that it affects how the video works. So that's something to be aware of. When you're shooting video, it does matter, but it doesn't matter as much. The shutter speed doesn't matter as much as long as you are above 30. You could have it cranked all the way up, and as long as the video looks good, it doesn't matter. Since we're only outputting at 30 frames a second, if it's above that, then it doesn't change much. So when you're shooting, I recommend trying to keep using the shutter as the primary way of controlling the light, because it's not going to affect as much. Like I said, if you use the aperture, you risk changing the look of the video a little bit. But with shutter, there's a lot more control because shutter speeds will go from 1/10 of a second to 1/5400ths and beyond that on some cameras. So you have a lot of in-betweenness that you can use to adjust. Whereas aperture, you normally have just a handful of stops to work with, and changing them will dramatically change the look of the video. So I recommend that when you're shooting, if you want to shoot on manual, you kind of choose an aperture, kind of keep it there, and then just use the shutter. I'd also recommend using aperture priority, again, where it'll let you change the shutter speed. But when you do that, again, be careful, because you don't know if the shutter speed will fall below a certain level. I don't know if our Canons will do that. I could be completely wrong, and our Canons, are smart enough to keep the shutter speed above 1/130th of a second. But we'll see. Just something for you to be aware of. And you might not use any of this. You might just shoot entirely on auto, and that's okay. But I think that when you know how something works, you have a little bit more freedom than if you just kind of trust the auto at all times. Same thing with autofocus. The TI5 autofocus is pretty good, and the kit lens, from what I understand, what I've read online, it's pretty decent. I typically shoot on manual focus, but that's just me. Not everyone wants to do it, because I don't like the possibility of my video, changing focus mid-shot. I like to compose the shot, shoot, recompose every time. But again, it's all subjective, whatever you think works. So if you have any questions, be sure to ask somebody, because we're not going to have a lot of time at training, from what I understand. So, there's no stupid questions, only the ones that you don't ask. So, I'll see you guys in a couple of weeks. Have a nice day.